Section 18 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 18. Judgement of a Solomon. From the Chinese of Pu Sung Ling, Herbert M. Giles, translator. In our district there lived two men, named Hu Cheng and Feng Nan, between whom there existed an old feud. The former, however, was the stronger of the two, and accordingly Feng disguised his feelings under a specious appearance of friendship, though Hu never placed much faith in his professions. One day they were drinking together, and being both of them rather the worse for liquor, they began to brag of the various exploits they had achieved. "What care I for poverty," cried Hu, "when I can lay 100 ounces of silver on the table at a moment's notice?" Now Feng was well aware of the state of Hu's affairs, and did not hesitate to scout such pretensions, until Hu further informed him in perfect seriousness that the day before he had met a merchant traveling with a large sum of money, and had tumbled him down a dry well by the wayside, in confirmation of which he produced several 100 ounces of silver, which really belonged to a brother-in-law, on whose behalf he was managing some negotiation for the purchase of land. When they separated, Feng went off and gave information to the magistrate of the place, who summoned Hu to answer to the charge. Hu then told the actual facts of the case, and his brother-in-law and the owner of the land in question corroborated his statement. However, on examining the dry well by letting a man down with a rope round him, lo, there was a headless corpse lying at the bottom. Hu was horrified at this, and called heaven to witness that he was innocent, whereupon the magistrate ordered him 20 or 30 blows on the mouth for lying in the presence of such irrefragable proof, and cast him into the condemned cell, where he lay loaded with chains. Orders were issued that the corpse was not to be removed, and a notification was made to the people, calling upon the relatives of the deceased to come forward and claim the body. Next day a woman appeared, and said deceased was her husband, that his name was Ho, and that he was proceeding on business with a large sum of money about him when he was killed by Hu. The magistrate observed that possibly the body in the well might not be that of her husband, to which the woman replied that she felt sure it was, and accordingly the corpse was brought up and examined, when the woman's story was found to be correct. She herself did not go near the body, but stood at a little distance, making the most doleful lamentation, until at length the magistrate said, "We have got the murderer, but the body is not complete. You go home and wait until the head has been discovered, when life shall be given for life." He then summoned Hu before him, and told him to produce the head by the next day, under penalty of severe torture. But Hu only wandered about with the guard sent in charge of him, crying and lamenting his fate, but finding nothing. The instruments of torture were then produced, and preparations were made as if for torturing Hu. However, they were not applied, and finally the magistrate sent him back to prison, saying, "I suppose that in your hurry you didn't notice where you dropped the head." The woman was then brought before him again, and on learning that her relatives consisted only of one uncle, the magistrate remarked, "A young woman like you, left alone in the world, will hardly be able to earn a livelihood." Here she burst into tears and implored the magistrate's pity. "The punishment of the guilty man has already been decided upon, but until we get the head, the case cannot be closed. As soon as it is closed, the best thing you can do is to marry again. A young woman like yourself should not be in and out of a police court." The woman thanked the magistrate and retired, and the latter issued a notice to the people, calling upon them to make a search for the head. On the following day, a man named Wang, a fellow villager of the deceased, reported that he had found the missing head, and his report proving to be true, he was rewarded with 1,000 cash. The magistrate now summoned the woman's uncle above mentioned, and told him that the case was complete, but that as it involved such an important matter as the life of a human being, there would necessarily be some delay in closing it for good and all. Translator's footnote. There is a widespread belief that human life in China is held at a cheap rate. This may be accounted for by the fact that death is the legal punishment for many crimes not considered capital in the West, and by the severe measures that are always taken in cases of rebellion when the innocent and guilty are often indiscriminately massacred. In times of tranquillity, however, this is not the case, and the execution of a criminal is surrounded by a number of formalities which go far to prevent the shedding of innocent blood. The Si Wan Lu opens with the words, "There is nothing more important than human life." Herbert M. Giles, translator. End of translator's footnote. Meanwhile, added the magistrate, your niece is a young woman and has no children. Persuade her to marry again, and so keep herself out of these troubles, and never mind what people may say. The uncle at first refused to do this, upon which the magistrate was obliged to threaten him until he was ultimately forced to consent. At this the woman appeared before the magistrate to thank him for what he had done, whereupon the latter gave out that any person who was willing to take the woman to wife was to present himself at his yamen. Immediately afterwards an application was made by the very man who had found the head. The magistrate then sent for the woman and asked her if she could say who was the real murderer, to which she replied that Hu Chen had done the deed. "No," cried the magistrate, "it was not he. It was you and this man here." Here both began loudly to protest their innocence. "I have long known this, but fearing to leave the smallest loophole for escape, I have tarried thus long in elucidating the circumstances." "How," to the woman, "before the corpse was removed from the well, were you so certain that it was your husband's body?" "Because you already knew he was dead. And does a trader who has several hundred ounces of silver about him dress as shabbily as your husband was dressed?" "And you," to the man, "how did you manage to find the head so readily?" "Because you were in a hurry to marry the woman." The two culprits stood there, as pale as death, unable to utter a word in their defense, and on application of torture both confessed the crime. For this man, the woman's paramour, had killed her husband, curiously enough, about the time of Hu Cheng's braggart joke. Hu was accordingly released, but Feng suffered the penalty of a false accuser. He was severely bambooed and banished for 3 years. The case was thus brought to a close without the wrongful punishment of a single person. End of section 18.